Well, welcome once again to Open Book. I'm your host, John Gray. I am a TV reporter and journalist in Albany, New York. I'm also an author myself with a number of books, children and otherwise. So I love talking to authors. When they wanted me to do a show, I could do anything I wanted. I say, I want to do a show on authors and give them some exposure and talk to them about the whole process. And I am joined right now by, guess what? It's another author. It is Scott Badler. He has a new book out called Becoming JFK. I'm going to hold it up here, give you an extra free plug. It's over your shoulder, but we'll show it here as well. How old is he in this picture in the cover? Is this? I'm guessing this is before he was president.
Yeah, 29, sure.
Wow. Okay. It's interesting with JFK. Even young pictures when he's like 10, 12 years old, he looks like JFK, just younger. You know,
Right.
He didn't change a lot. So I'm going to bring this up right here. So we got your book between us, Scott. Before we get to this book, and I do want to talk a lot about JFK and what you've written here, tell me a little bit about you. For those who don't know who you are, where are you from? What was your career? Is it just writing, or did you do other things as well?
Okay, I'm originally a Californian, and so I've been the greater part of my life there. But I did move to Boston back in the '80s and lived there for a number of years. And actually, while I was there, I went to a number of events at the Kennedy Library and the Harvard Kennedy School. So sort of, fraternized with the Kennedys there and sort of got me interested in the Kennedys. But I've always written, do some sports writing, and actually I taught humor writing at Harvard, and I wrote a couple of humor books. So there's still a little humor with Kennedy. He was very witty and everything. So I think it kind of transfers over.
Was your career always writing, Scott, or did you do other things? Were you a journalist as well? Did I read in your bio?
I did some journalism. Yeah, I worked for some newspapers, did some freelance stuff. My last job was actually working for the fire department. So I wasn't a firefighter. Everybody sort of thinks that, but I was in education, community affairs, emergency preparedness, and then when I retired, I thought I'd go full time into writing. So it's worked out great.
A lot of writers I've talked to, and it's true of me as well. They didn't start out writing a book the first thing they wrote. They say, oh, no. I wrote essays for this, or I wrote a newspaper column there, or I did, nowadays it's more like blogging and things. Was there writing that came before your books for you in terms of just honing the craft a little bit?
Yeah, I did, like I said, I did a certain amount of journalism. That was in newspapers and things like that. So that certainly sort of honed it. Did some profiles. So this is basically a profile of JFK. So I think that sort of honed my skills where I could sort of really expand it. Just taking it a chapter at a time, and that's kind of what I did. I always had some research skills that I honed.
And at what age did you do the first book? Were you a lot younger, or did this come on later in life when you started getting into the publishing world with books?
My first book was actually my graduate thesis. It was called "What's So Funny About Looking for a Job." So that was my graduate thesis at Cambridge College, and it was sort of a humor book, a parody. And then I wrote one about sibling rivalry. Then I got a little more serious after that, and I started investigating the Kennedys a little bit, and wrote that first one, which is historical fiction on JFK and the Muckers of Choate.
In terms of your book, did you sort of write these on spec where you wanted to write them and then you pitch them, or did you kind of pitch an idea or an outline and get a book deal where somebody said, yeah, that sounds interesting, Scott, give me 5 chapters and maybe we'll do a deal with you? How did it work with you as a writer?
Yeah, I wrote the whole thing, and then I thought, well, I'll try and get a literary agent, and that didn't work out. I always had my backup plan is to go to small independent publishers and someone who really wanted to work with me, spend time with me. So I found Bancroft Press, and that has really worked out really, really well. So they published the first book, the second one, and I think we have a good future together.
For those who don't understand writing, you don't have to be on the New York Times bestsellers list to be successful, right? I mean, you could have a niche out there for a smaller independent publisher and sell enough copies where it works for them, correct, in terms of how it works money-wise, where they're like, yeah, we're not making $1 million on your book or $10 million like a Stephen King book or a John Grisham, but, you've got a little niche there and we like what you're doing, and that can work too, right?
Right, right. I mean, especially with me. I mean, there's so many Kennedy aficionados. There's been actually, I think, thousands of books written on the Kennedys, and more to come. It's insatiable. So you have that direct audience, that niche of Kennedy lovers or can be haters who want to read about the next Kennedy book.
What is it about the Kennedys? Because I'll give you a personal anecdote. Years ago, I mean, I'm 63 now, so this would have been over 40 years ago. My family and I went to Boston one day, the whole group of us. My mom, dad were alive at the time. And my sister was like an anniversary. She researched and said there's a restaurant called Jimmy's Harborside, which is this great restaurant and it overlooks Logan Airport. And it was expensive, but we went there. I'm getting to a point with the Kennedys. And as I'm sitting there waiting to get seated, I'm in this area with pictures, and there's Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy having eaten there. It's like I'm standing next to the bar where Jack Kennedy was. Oh my gosh. Even though it was just a restaurant, just being in that proximity of where he was, what it is about the Kennedys. I mean, I know people say they're kind of like America's royalty. Is that a fair assessment that they just were elevated to a different level?
I think so, and what is it, how has it happened? Well, they're sort of very good looking. I mean, JFK was very handsome, had the beautiful wife, the beautiful kids. All the tragedy involved, I think, has led to, this, can't look away,
Yeah.
you want to look away. And, just this recent tragedy with his granddaughter. So, we always want to know what the Kennedys are doing, and they always seem to be up to something. And they're just, charismatic, magnetic. We're forever interested. There's always something, key thing, of course, with JFK, the assassination, he's cut down early in life. And I think that's part of it that, he's, a mythic figure just because of that.
Yeah. I mean, well, I might be a little older than you. I'm not sure what your age is at, but just the images of JFK Jr. with the saluting the hearse going by and the carriage, and boy, it is a mythical family. Both, and it does. If everything was smelling roses and perfect for them, it'd be a less compelling story, I guess, in the zeitgeist of our minds. But with the triumph and the tragedy, it really is something we're drawn to, isn't it?
Right, right. It's the combination. It's not all ups and, incredible amount of tragedies. So I think we're drawn to both things, the Cuban Missile Crisis, but then all the tragedies of the assassinations. It's the combination of everything.
Right. All right. We're talking to Scott Badler. The book is called Becoming JFK. We will get into exactly what this book is about. And I can't wait to really delve into it and read it, Scott. But we'll come back with more on the book with our author on Open Book in just 1 second. All right, welcome back to the show here. Becoming JFK is the book. Scott Badler's the author of this. This is not your first book on JFK. Describe the other book you had. It had an interesting title, I remember.
Yeah, JFK and the Muckers of Choate. I suddenly became aware of JFK being this rebellious figure. We never think of JFK as a teenager, and I find out, wow, he was in jail, that he was kicked out of school, that he led this group, the Muckers, that was anti-administration. His best friend he met at prep school was gay. So this whole story of high school, prep school at Choate School in Connecticut, I, wound a story, how he, was that sort of rebellious figure. And then, after that, I went, directly on from there. And this new book is nonfiction. The other one was historical fiction. And it pretty much begins with JFK in jail right after he graduates from prep school.
Talk to me about fiction versus historical fiction. What's the difference there for those who don't understand?
Yeah, the historical fiction, the main outlines of the story are true, but you can sort of, add anything you want. You can add scenes, you can add dialogue, you can add characters. So I did a little of that in the historical fiction. Most of it is, true, but when I went to nonfiction, all the scenes are true to life. I didn't make up any events. The dialogue is true for the most extent. I made up a little bit of dialogue, but it's all factual as opposed to the historical fiction of the first book.
Got you. So this book now, this one has some of the dialogue that you were able to sort of invent based on what you know and your research?
Right, right.
How much research goes into a book like this? Do you just spend 6 months a year pulling stuff together and saying, almost putting up post-it notes, this would be interesting and I got to make sure I hit on this? And is it like putting a jigsaw puzzle together?
Yeah, well, this one made it a little bit easier. My books, they're sort of chronological. So as opposed to, creating events, whatever, I mean, it follows JFK from a certain point forward till the end. So, I made trips out to the Kennedy Library there, and that's always a great experience there. It's very secretive, and you have to take everything out of your pockets, and they're watching you, make sure you don't steal something. So at the JFK Library, you go out to Hyannis and take a look at the compound, and go to the library there. And of course, there's the internet, and then like I say, there's thousands of books of on the Kennedys and all these oral. One thing that's really important is all these oral things that his friends would did for the Kennedy Library. So you can look at those and use those in your research, and then put them into the book.
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny anecdote. I've never been, I love the Kennedys, but I've never been to that library. And the one time I planned a trip, I took the day off from work. I had a hotel room. I had the whole thing planned. And I believe Barack Obama was president, and he was entertaining in Boston some foreign dignitary. And like the day before, the White House announced that the guy coming into town, I guess through his people, said to Obama, "I really want to see the Kennedy Library when I'm there. Could I see that?" And they said, "Oh, of course, the president will do a walking tour. He'll walk." And of course, you know what that means. The minute the president of the United States and I forget what leader it was, they shut the whole thing down for about 4 hours, which is my window to go. So I guess I missed out on that. But I can read your book and get caught up on it, I suppose. So how did things sit with is it Joe Senior? The father was a big presence in Jack's life, and I get the impression, everything I've read and looking into your book a little bit, he was, I don't want to say a taskmaster, but pretty demanding of what he wanted from his sons. It was, a lot of this was sort of mapped out in Joe's mind, wasn't it? Of what he expected. Getting suspended from school or being kind of a rabble rouser must not have sat well with Dad.
Yeah, that's certainly true. When they spent, a couple overnight in jail, he could have bailed them out, but he said, why don't you guys stay overnight in jail and think about it a little bit. So he was very unhappy about that. But he wanted one of his sons to be president. He was the ambassador, and he had a chance to run for president, and it didn't work out. So he wanted Joe to be the president, and resources were going to be put in him to be the next president. But one of the myths is that until Joe died during World War II, that he was the one that was going to put all the resources into being president. But in my opinion, JFK had already passed him by in a number of different ways. I mean, he'd written a book. He was a war hero, and symbolically, he'd actually passed Joe in rank. He was a full lieutenant, while Joe was a junior grade lieutenant. So he'd passed Joe by, and I think the ambassador, their father, was going to say, "Hey, we'll let you both. We'll both, run and see what happens."
Yeah, talk about the war a little bit, because I would have to believe with that last name, they had money, that Dad could have pulled some strings, or Jack could have said, "Hey, get me out of this, and I really don't want to go risk my life." He was in the Navy, correct, Jack Kennedy?
Well,
Talk about that.
yeah, it was just the opposite, actually. Jack was turned down because of all his ailments. And so he had his father pull some strings so he could pass the exam, because he failed the exam with all his back problems and everything else. So, he really wanted to get in there and, serve his country. And also, he knew if he wanted to be a politician, you needed to have that in your background. So that was part of it. That was part of it, certainly.
Yeah, there's certainly with some politicians checking the boxes, and military service, having the perfect wife, and Jackie certainly checked that box for him as well. Not that she wasn't wonderful on her own, that she needed Jack to be special, but she certainly was beloved by a lot of people. Going back to the war, you mentioned in your notes in your book PT 109. What exactly is that, and why is that in your book? Why is that important?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say, if it hadn't been for PT 109, he never would have been president. So this is an event where he was a PT boat skipper, which was these fast, mobile boats that had torpedoes, and they would kind of harass the Japanese Navy in the Pacific, the Solomon Islands. So he was the skipper of one, and one night he had just done patrols, and then one night suddenly they went into battle, and things had sort of calmed down, and then out of the blue, or out of the black, it was a very black night. This Japanese destroyer came and sort of just about cut the PT-109 in half. And so, I have to say JFK wasn't so he was a little bit of sleep at the wheel before the Japanese destroyer hit. But afterwards, he was certainly very heroic.
Yeah, this what you're describing is not somebody who, because we both know, especially now in 2026, if you were famous, said, "Well, I'm going to serve," they could, let's say you're almost like Elvis or somebody, where you could put a uniform on, stand in front of the ship. Let's get a couple shots of that, and let's bend down like you're loading the weapon. We're good with that. But the last thing they want to do is take somebody who's important, put quotes around it, and put them in harm's way. This sounds like all bets were off with that. He was serving, and he was in harm's way, and things could have went differently for him that night that the ship got cut in half.
Right. Same thing with his brother. They both wanted to serve and they put themselves, certainly in harm's way. And, he certainly was in harm's way with that when the destroyer came through. And, it was a very big thing where, two of his crewmen were killed. And, like I say, Jack was, a little bit responsible. There's always been this thing where didn't have all his engines running and he should have. The reason was the previous couple of weeks he'd been strafed by Japanese planes and they saw the effervescence of the motors and they could pick out where he was, so he decided to go to one engine, but when you're in battle you got to have three engines so you can get away very quick.
Yeah, it makes sense. Where does this book begin in his life, and where does it take us to in terms of becoming JFK?
Okay, it pretty much begins at a party when they go to Martha's Vineyard for the Edgartown races. He and Joe are going to be racing there, and they do okay. They don't win. That's one something his father always wanted is second places for losers. But
Yeah.
anyway, they didn't win. But he gave him a lot of money to after it's over have a big party. So they did, and it got out of hand. And it was sort of a key point there. Joe, as the older brother, should have done something to stop it, but he didn't. And they get hauled away off to jail. And I think it was a key point for Jack when he says, I got to rely on myself, not listen to my older brother all the time. And from there, I think he went his own way. And then so it travels on through, JFK. He's sort of the eyes and ears of his father just before World War II. So it covers his travels. He has kind of two purposes. One, he's researching his master's thesis, which turns into a book, Why England Slept. And also he's the eyes and ears for his father as World War II is beginning. And it ends with his winning his congressional campaign in 1946.
So you take it right up to the congressional campaign. Yeah, there's been so much written about JFK, the president. It's interesting you're focusing on this chunk of his life. Have there been movies? I mean, what struck me looking through your book is I'm like, maybe there have been, and I haven't seen them. Have there been miniseries or movies? With all the streaming stuff now, it seems like this would be a fascinating story. I'm already doing the wheels turning of who they'd cast as a young JFK, but it seems like there's enough story there way before that terrible drive in Dallas where we lost him to tell here.
Right. There was a book by Nigel Hamilton, but it's almost 40 years ago called Reckless Youth. So that covers his, this similar period there. And I found out some new interesting information. It was actually made into a TV movie too. So it has been covered and hopefully we can, get something going that shows it in a new light.
Absolutely. We're talking to Scott Badler, Becoming JFK is the book. Back with our final segment with our author this week, coming up right after this. All right, welcome back to our final segment here on Open Book, where we talk to authors not only about their books, but about the process of becoming an author and all that good stuff. And joining us again is Scott Badler from Becoming JFK. How long did it take you to research and then to write this? I'm curious, Scott.
Oh, it's about 2.5 years. You go through a number of drafts and changes and everything. And so it took about 2.5 years. The first one was in first person. This is third person. So a little bit of a change there that I had to get used to, but about 2.5 years.
Is it tricky for you as an author when you talk about first person, second person, third person? One of my challenges I found as a journalist writing books is taking off my journalism hat the way I would write things where it's more the whole show versus tell. Is that tricky for you? Do you slip in and out of it where you sort of go, you got to remind yourself how you're approaching this book, or have you done enough of these now that it just comes natural?
Yeah, it was a challenge. The first one it's kind of strange, but it was first person. So in effect, JFK and the Muckers, I was JFK.
Right.
I tell you, you really get into the character there. So
Sure.
the next one, there's some distance, and I think it was helpful to have some distance from JFK and look at it more, from a further back point of view.
I know with actors, I've heard many actors when they talk, how'd you play that bad guy so well? He's so evil, and a lot of actors will tell you when they're acting, I never looked at him as an evil person. If you start getting this caricature in your head, it messes with the whole thing. I think as a writer too, and you could agree or disagree with this. You have to be careful, A, not to fall in love with your character you're writing about, or also to look at some of the scandals and want to villainize him or, be a little harsher. You have to sort of keep your hand out of it in that way.
Yeah, I wanted to not continue the sort of mythic quality of JFK because he had a lot of faults. He's human. He was cheap. He was always borrowing money and not paying it back. He was pretty narcissistic. He pretty much objectified women. So there are things about him, like any human, that are not that pleasant to hear about. But I think it's important to hear about that part as well as his other qualities. He was quite a courageous guy, and he had illness throughout his life, and I think it's really important to know about the good and the bad.
It's funny looking back on politicians and how we judge history based on today's standards versus then. You've got to be, would you agree, you have to be fair in terms of the womanizing or the different things. And I'm not excusing anything he did or didn't do, but you have to remember 1960 is different than 2026.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So your question is?
You have to look at it through the lens of the time a little bit, right? In terms of morally judging now, saying, "Well, I don't even like this guy because I'm reading about I would have done this or I would have said that if I was back then there." And it was a different time 60 years ago.
Right, right. Everything is, in front of the camera, social media, so wherever you go that, you're going to be looked at. Trump seems to get away with everything. It doesn't seem to matter in a certain way. It's sort of going back to, the 60s in a certain way, but it certainly was a different time, right?
Yeah, well, what's interesting with Trump, and we're not going to go off on a side street here, but I think a strategy there, this is my own opinion, is if I say something outrageous 15 times a day, it's almost like when a kid watches violence on TV and your mom walks in and goes, "Oh my God, how can you watch that guy? Oh, that's like the 19th stabbing I've seen." You sort of get conditioned to it and you sort of swat it away. So
Right.
maybe there's a strategy there. Do you think JFK even gets elected today if he were around because of social media, all these things, or maybe he would behave differently knowing that everybody's got a camera on their phone?
That's an interesting question. I think he would. He was still very smart. He was magnetic, and I think he still would have been elected. I think he would have. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you feel like we'll ever grow tired of talking about the Kennedys and reading these books? Because I don't see it letting up at all. I really don't.
It doesn't seem to ever end. And I bet I don't think we'll ever get tired of it. It's sort of amazing that there's a new angle, or after 40 years, you can do a recreation of something that happened 40 years ago. It seems to go on forever. Yeah.
It really does. Is this the last Kennedy book for you, or are you already thinking about another book? Is this is the second of you had the first one on I forgot the title of it, the Muckers. Is there another book coming that you want to pick up? Because you seem to like this part of his life, this before he was in the White House, that part of his life.
Right. And so I'm really not that interested in being, his life as a congressman or as a senator, and all the rest of it as president, has been done. So, this is my last book on Kennedy, I'm pretty sure.
Well, it's interesting. It occurred to me as you're saying that before he's president, before he's in Congress, his life is a little more wild, and maybe that's normal because I'm not being scrutinized. I'm not in Congress where you say, "Hey, you can't do that. You're a congressman now." I mean, he was a kid at one time, and he had his friends, and he really was like a lot of us, wasn't he? In some way, I know he had privilege and everything, but at 20 years old, he's still a 20-year-old guy and doing 20-year-old guy stuff.
Right. He was sort of, reckless and, seeing the world. I mean, he had the resources to do it, to go to South America, to travel throughout Europe. So he had the resources to do that. But, he really had just an interest in seeing the world.
He did travel a lot, didn't he? I mean, I think people see him as, oh, Kennedy. Yeah, he was. I think he was born like in Hyannis, which is not really where he was born, but he sailed boats, and then his father said you should be president, and they rigged an election. He won, and then he got killed, and that was the end of him. And it's like, no, you're skipping a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, he was pretty well traveled, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think the key part of his life is actually, in Europe there. That's where he, gets a sense of diplomacy, how governments work there. And like I say, in 1939, he goes on this trip and he goes all the way to the Middle East there. And he has, a great source for me was all his letters. I mean, those days they wrote a lot of letters. So the letters he wrote to his father, assessing the situation in the Middle East, the Jews and the Arabs are going at it there. He goes to Romania, he goes to Russia, flies to Russia on some prop plane. So he sees all of Europe and, part of Asia. So he sees a lot of the world, while he's still young.
Did he have a good relationship with his dad, or was it sort of depends on the day of the week?
I think he had a pretty good relationship with his father. I mean, it was sort of mixed in a certain way that his father was, always on him, and pushed him. And so sometimes that can be very difficult. But I think in the end, that was maybe Jack needed a little bit. He could be a little bit lazy at some point. I think he had a pretty good relationship with his father.
I meant to ask you earlier. I've heard so much about JFK's back problems, and I was surprised. I thought that came later in life. You mentioned in the book he was young when he was having issues. Do we know whatever happened there? Was there an injury in a fall or sports or something?
Well, they say, it's a little bit hard to tell, but there was a little football injury and he was trying to make the team at Harvard. It didn't help, being a PT boat skipper and bouncing on the waves,
Sure.
So, and then it made it worse where he actually took steroids. They were just beginning in the 1930s. So he took steroids so he could go through his trip in Europe. And then also when he was a PT boat skipper, and that kind of led to his spine kind of going downhill from there. It sort of it affected that.
Gotcha. We only got a minute left. Is there another book in the works? It's not JFK, or are you just going to kind of relax now with this book for a little while?
I'm working on it, but it's a secret. But it's going to be even bigger than this one here. A very important figure, and everybody knows him. But I'm working on it, and hopefully we'll be back on you and with you in another couple of years there, and we'll be able to go over the new book because I think you'll find it very exciting.
Well, I'm excited to read this book. I'm going to hold it up again. Becoming JFK. It's just my kind of length too. I don't need a book like The Stand that's 9,000 pages. I like a book that's not a pamphlet, but you can sit down. It looks like 3 or 4 good sittings, and I could get through this thing. But
And there's some incredible pictures there too. I don't know if you had a chance to look on the
I
pictures.
know. I'll definitely check that out.
Yeah.
All right, Scott Badler. The book is Becoming JFK. Where can they get it, Scott? Everywhere, Amazon, everywhere.
You bet.
All right.
ScottBadler.net. You can look at there too. Yeah.
That's right. You've got your own page as well. All right, author Scott Badler. Thanks for coming on and for bringing us this great book. We appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
All right, that's going to do it for all of us here on Open Book. I'm John Gray. Thank you for watching. We'll see you here next time. And don't forget, keep reading.